Okay, hello everybody. I am Karina Schumann. I'm an associate professor in the psychology department here at Pitt. I gave this presentation earlier today, but I got caught off because of wireless connection issues that I happen to have in my office from time to time. So I really apologize to those of you who were there and for whom the presentation wasn't complete. But I'm recording this from the beginning, and hopefully you can just scroll through to the end if you were there, or watch it from the beginning if you weren't, in case you wanted to see the entire presentation. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about how we can manage difficult conversations with our trainees. And I was asked to do this presentation because I direct the conflict resolution lab, where I focus on how we can move towards constructive conflict resolution responses, things like apologies, forgiveness, empathy, humility, and effective communication strategies in our conflicts. And you might be wondering, how do we happen to have conflicts with our trainees? Is this something that really happens? Especially people who are new to mentoring, this might be a question that you have. But there are going to be a number of times where you might have to have a difficult conversation with a trainee. Some that I thought of, or probably most likely, is when a trainee is not meeting the milestones that you expect them to be meeting. They're not meeting the standards for milestones. Other requirements, like their coursework, are not up to par. They're not consistently not meeting deadlines, and they're falling short in terms of productivity. Sometimes you're seeing a lack of motivation. You're starting to see this consistently, and it's becoming a problem, and kind of feeding back into that first point where you're concerned about their productivity. Sometimes you'll see evidence that there's some concerning behavior happening in their roles as TAs when they're mentoring undergrads towards research participants, if they're running research in the lab. Things like not being responsive to their students, not showing up for meetings, being overly harsh with feedback, being unprofessional with research participants. And certainly that would require a conversation. Sometimes there might be concerns that they're disrupting an inclusive climate that you're striving for, that your department is striving for, or might be committing microaggressions that are certainly of concern. Perhaps there are academic integrity concerns or violations that need to be discussed. And sometimes the student will also come to you with concerns that they have, either about their own progress or your relationship with them or some of your own mentoring, and that will trigger the need for a difficult conversation. So these are just some of the reasons why these conversations might need to take place. You might have your own experiences with different types of situations, but there's a broad array of situations where there needs to be effective communication occurring between a mentor and a trainee so that you can move forward and try to initiate behavior change and see improvement. So today I'm going to try to start to think about some of the ways in which we can have these conversations more effectively. I'm going to begin by talking about the importance of direct, constructive communication. I'm then going to talk about how we can position ourselves to hear and understand the trainee so that we can really nurture the relationship and develop trust so that we can start to see improvement in the future. And then I'll go into some specifics about how you might collaborate with the trainee to really work through their goals and how they might implement those goals to improve in the future. And then I'll offer just some final thoughts about how we can have these conversations effectively. So first, I just want to say that when it comes to conflicts or conflictual interactions, communication is a huge contributor. This is the wheel of conflict, which is one way of understanding the sources that are at the root of most conflicts. And certainly at the center is some need that's not being met, right? We have these needs of various types, and these needs are not being met. And usually that's because the other party is thwarting that need in some way. But you see that communication is one of the 5 major factors that those needs are embedded in. And that's because ineffective communication is typically a factor that escalates and contributes to conflict. And effective communication is one of the main ways that you can effectively resolve your conflicts. But the problem is that, even though we've been communicating since birth, we are not really taught how to communicate. This is not something that's usually at the forefront of our minds. A lot of us have not given much thought to it. And it's just not something that is necessarily a skill that we've worked on or that we're very mindful about. And so I'm going to try to make us more mindful of how we communicate in these difficult conversations today. The first thing I'd like to say is that silence is not helpful. So a lack of communication is really not going to be an effective strategy here. And we might often think that it is. We might think, oh, this is my way of showing compassion. You let things slide over and over. You feel compassion for the student. They've got a lot going on, and you don't want to be feeling like you're criticizing them or adding more to their plate. And so we might not say anything much of the time. I've definitely done this before. And I've realized through experience that this is really not a good approach. And it's not a good approach for a number of reasons. One sort of group of reasons involves that reducing the possibility for improvement. So if you're not communicating to the student what is happening, if they're unaware, then there's going to be little opportunity for them to change. So if they don't understand the problem, this is a major problem towards behavioral barrier to behavior change, right? So this communication can really signal to them that there is some sort of problem, and they might be completely unaware without that communication occurring. The trainee might also have an inaccurate sense of their progress, of their trajectory, of their ability to succeed post-training, their ability to get a job. And this may come as a very harsh surprise to them if these conversations aren't being had that can prepare them for really their realistic opportunities that lie ahead for them if they continue on the trajectory that they're on. Silence also denies the trainee opportunities to learn how to hear and be responsive to constructive feedback. This is an extremely important skill that they need in any kind of career path, to be able to listen to feedback and integrate that feedback and be coachable and have a growth-minded approach to hearing constructive feedback. And it's something that really having that practice can be beneficial because it's not something that most of us are that good at. So denying them that opportunity is doing them a disservice. And then it can also become problematic because what will happen is you'll think, oh, that's just a small error. Oh, this is just a little problem. Oh, there it is again. But, there's nothing too major right now. And what happens is these things build up and build up and build up. And to the point where, eventually you might have that conversation, or eventually they're faced with evidence that they're not, that there is this problem, or they're not performing adequately. And then, this mountain of problems will feel really insurmountable. So it's definitely preferable to start to identify these problems with them and work on them little by little, as opposed to piling it all on at once when it at that point feels very overwhelming and demoralizing for them. A second reason why silence is not helpful is that it can really undermine the relationship between the mentor and the trainee. Over time, if you are, having these issues with the trainee, but you're not able to communicate it, if you're not able to, if they're not motivated to change their behavior because they're unaware of it, because they don't know how big of a problem it is, it's not going to change, most likely. And so you might come to resent them because you might feel they're wasting your time, that you could be, spending your time advising someone who's more motivated or more productive, all of those kinds of things. And that resentment will really start to erode the relationship with the trainee, and they'll pick up on it. There's no question. And the trainee might also pick up on the fact that you're really not communicating with them. They might have concerns about their own productivity. They might be somewhat aware, but not really sure, or maybe they're just simply aware that something's not right, and that there's not really clear and open communication between the two of you. And that might, erode their trust in you as a mentor to provide them with honest and necessary feedback. So all of these points really suggest that silence, certainly you don't want to nitpick at every single thing, but when you start to see patterns that are problematic, silence is not the best approach. So what should you do instead? You should have the conversation, and it can be scary, and a lot of us are conflict avoidant, and we don't want to have these difficult conversations. They're very uncomfortable. But what I'm going to do today is try to encourage you to have the conversations and provide you with some guidelines for how to have them and to make them a more comfortable, smooth, and effective experience. So first, I'm just going to go through some basic guidelines for how to structure the conversation, and then I'll talk about some of the communication strategies that we certainly want to avoid in these conversations, but that we might often fall prey to. And then I'll talk about some other factors to consider when having these conversations, including empathy and goal setting. So one of the basic things that you want to think about is to identify a safe place to talk, somewhere where you'll both be comfortable. This is probably going to be a private space. You know, sometimes grad students have shared offices. You don't want to have it in that place. They might be, you might, want to have it over coffee out in public. Probably not the best place to have it, where someone that they know might walk in and overhear. Okay, so you really want to give them a place, a safe place where they feel comfortable being open, being willing to disclose, and being receptive to the feedback you're going to share with them without worrying about everything else that's going on around them. You want to be transparent about the purpose of the conversation so that they're not surprised by it. Certainly you don't want to tell them far in advance and then have them stress over it for weeks, but just at the beginning of the conversation, you might lay out that you're going to be giving them some constructive feedback in this conversation and talking about their progress or talking about something that's been occurring, so that when you jump into it, they don't feel completely shocked and surprised and then put up a wall because they're scared and feeling defensive. And what we tend to do in these conversations to make them, run a little more smoothly is we tend to sort of beat around the bush. We tend to avoid direct communication where we're telling them, hard feedback about how things are progressing or the problems that you're seeing. And that might feel better to use some of those indirect strategies, but it's not going to be as effective as a communication strategy. So you want to focus on using direct yet constructive communication. So what this means is not being overly harsh, not being super critical or anything like that, but focusing on the concrete issues at hand. Okay, so you want to convey the full exact meaning through the words that you're using. Okay, you want to take what's in your brain and communicate that clearly and directly to the student. So your main goals here are clarity and honesty, in supportive, not harsh ways, but certainly in clear, not beating around the bush kind of ways. You want to avoid miscommunication, and you want to avoid requiring them to go, I think what they're saying is this, and making them read between the lines. They said this, but I think that means that I should be doing this. That's not that helpful for them. You want to be as clear as possible, and using direct communication where you're telling them exactly what you mean through your words is the most effective way to do that. And something more concrete that might be helpful when thinking about direct communication is to really be mindful to focus on the concrete and actionable. Okay, so outline the specific issues that are of concern and give them concrete examples of what the problem is, as well as what you want to see improve. So that might look like something like, maybe I feel that the student is coming to meetings unprepared and we're wasting an hour of time. We're not making much progress. They haven't made much progress since last week. And this is not a very productive use of time. So you can say that. When you come to meetings, I have seen that you are not prepared. You are not coming to me with the analyses completed or with a plan for how to move forward or with that lit review done or whatever it is that you want them to be working on. And that there's no structure to our meeting. So we end up spending a lot of time, thinking through things that are not really that relevant or being unfocused during the meeting. What I'd like to see is this and this and this. So I'd like to see you come to this meeting prepared in these ways. I'd like for the next meeting to, at the end of the meeting for us to outline exactly what you're going to complete by the next meeting, that kind of thing, right? So very direct, concrete ideas for what the problem is in terms of what they're doing and how they can fix that problem, okay? So definitely something you want to keep in mind. Now, in addition to being very direct and concrete in the feedback you're providing, you're going to want to avoid certain strategies that tend to leak into the way that we communicate with people in conflict situations. Now, these communication strategies were called the four horsemen of the apocalypse. This was the term used by John Gottman, who's a very prominent relationships researcher. And these four horsemen were named because they are extremely destructive processes that he started to see in the way couples communicate with each other. However, these are communication strategies that we see all the time in all different types of relationship contexts, and they're destructive in all types of relationship contexts. And they're going to be particularly destructive when you are trying to communicate difficult feedback to a trainee. So I want you to keep these in mind and always be mindful to structure your feedback in ways that avoids these communication tactics. And sometimes they might be more subtle, and you might need to go, oh, is that really what I'm doing? And kind of just reflect on how you would communicate in these situations to get a sense of whether or not you might be using any of these when you interact with your trainees. Okay, so number one, criticism. Now you might be thinking, well, I thought that was the whole point of direct feedback. Aren't we supposed to criticize what they're doing? And, yeah, constructive criticism, we hear that term a lot. But there are ways to provide negative feedback to people in terms of what they're doing wrong or what you need to see improved that isn't critical, okay? So there's a difference between voicing criticism and voicing a complaint or a concern about behavior. Criticism is focused on the person, on their character, on their aptitude. It's an attack on the person. Whereas a complaint or expressing some sort of concern can really be focused on a specific behavior. It's, the difference between focusing on the process versus on the person, which we know it's beneficial to focus on process, both with negative feedback and positive feedback. Okay, so when you criticize people in any context, but in this specific context, if you criticize your trainee, if you call them irresponsible, if you say that they're just unmotivated, if you accuse them of various types of character defects, then this is going to really harm the relationship. It's going to make them feel hurt. It's going to make them feel angry. It's certainly going to cause them to be defensive. And it's really going to deflate their motivation. If they feel like there's something flawed about their character or their aptitude, they're going to feel like it's a lost cause. And it's going to really demoralize them when it comes to thinking about change. So really tend to focus on the behaviors that are problematic rather than making any kind of person-focused accusations. Contempt. Now, you might think, oh, I never do these kinds of things, but there are subtle ways to show contempt that we might be seeing leak into our conversations a little bit, or our behaviors. So a contempt is really when you make someone feel inferior. You treat them with disrespect, you use sarcasm, you ridicule, name call, mimic. You use body language that suggests that you're not interested in them. So you might roll your eyes, cross your arms, really show a lack of interest and disengagement in what they're saying. And so these cues, even if you think, oh, I would never call someone, a bad name or really, disrespect them directly, this disrespect, this feeling of, you're a waste of my time or I'm frustrated with you, can seep out in other forms, or especially nonverbal forms of the way we interact with people. And it can also, seep out in other types of language that we use or behaviors, things like anytime we imply that our valuable time is being wasted, that you've got other more important things to do. Maybe you are devaluing their perspective when it comes to the work that you're talking about. Maybe you don't really listen to the contributions they're making, or you always imply that your views are superior. These are all going to make them feel inferior and despised, and contempt is probably the single most harmful behavior or feeling that can occur between two people. It inflicts irreparable relationship damage, and it's very hard to come back from. So really be mindful that you, even in times of struggle with students, in times when you're very frustrated with them, even when you feel disrespected by them because they're not, using your time wisely, or they don't feel invested, to try to communicate with respect so that they don't feel this sense of contempt from you, because it will be a very destructive feeling that will do a lot of damage to your relationship with them. Okay, defensiveness. This is something that we are all very prone to. It is certainly going to come up during these conversations. It's going to be something that we're going to be, very tempted to engage in, because during these conversations, it's very likely that some students will attack back. They're going to, say, well, you want these things from me, but you're not always there for me. You're not turning things around as quickly as you should be. You're missing meetings too, that kind of thing, right? So there might be some pushing of the blame onto you, maybe in a little more subtle ways than that. But certainly there might be some pushback from the trainee that suggests that you are at least in part responsible for this. And in all likelihood, you probably are to some extent. But even if you're not, this is the kind of thing that can happen during these conversations where they're going to have a counter argument. And so it might be, tempting to protect ourselves from these attacks, right? So we'll engage in excuses or justifications, certainly blaming the other person, minimizing our responsibility. And that's basically what defensiveness is. These are all strategies that reduce our responsibility for the problem. So I'd like to encourage us, when we're having these conversations, to really go into it with an openness to hearing what they have to say about our part in the issues at hand, if we did have any part, and to really be receptive to that, rather than defensive when we are faced with that kind of information. Because ultimately, defensiveness might feel good in the moment. It might feel like this is what we need to do, but it's rarely successful, and it often escalates the conflict or leads to a stalemate. And then finally, stonewalling. So stonewalling is basically when we shut down. We're not responsive. We don't want to hear them talk. We don't want to hear their side of things. Or maybe this, manifests in us just not showing up for them. We're canceling meetings with them. We're inattentive during our meetings with them. It's a lack of investment where we're saying we're sort of done. We're shutting down here. And of course, this is not going to be very beneficial in terms of nurturing the relationship or helping them through these struggles. It can leave them feeling ignored, frustrated, disrespected, and really just not knowing how to move forward. If their mentor has, one foot out the door, then what is the pathway forward from there? So really try to stay engaged, stay committed, even though it's tough at times, and always try to, effortfully remain responsive to the trainee despite the challenges that they're presenting. Okay, so that's a lot of what not to do. And I'm going to now kind of switch into some of the things that I would like to encourage you to do instead during these conversations. So the overarching theme in this next section is how you can position yourself to hear and understand the trainee. And really what you want to do here is focus on empathy. I know empathy is something that we hear a lot, and empathy is an incredibly powerful process. It predicts a whole slew of positive things, and it's going to be really important in your role as a mentor to all kinds of different trainees. So what is empathy first? Empathy has three core facets. One facet is experience sharing. This is what people often think of when they imagine empathy. This is when you catch other people's emotions, you feel what they're feeling, you really connect with their emotional experience. Mentalizing is more cognitive. It's when we take the other person's perspective, understand their vantage point. We're thinking about why they feel the way they do and think the way they think. And then finally, compassion. This is the affective response that we feel in response to this person's experience. We have concern over their state. And this is usually paired with a desire to help, because typically when we feel compassion for others, we want to help alleviate any suffering or pain that we see occurring. So these facets are all aspects of empathy. Sometimes they correspond really closely to each other. Sometimes you might, experience high mentalizing, but less experience sharing, and they split apart in different ways. But I just want you to keep that definition in mind when thinking about how you might see empathy in your role and how you might modulate your empathy experience, as I'll get to in a couple of minutes. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment and reflect on how empathy features in your role as a mentor. When do you experience empathy? When is it important to experience empathy? In what sense do you think it is really vital to your role or really beneficial to the trainee for you to be empathic? So I'd like you to take a moment to reflect on that, either during or after this session. And I'd also like us to start to recognize common and personal barriers to feeling empathy for your trainees. So what this looks like is, situations where we either prevent ourselves from feeling empathy because we disengage from the situation, or we don't feel a very kind of natural or automatic pull towards empathy in that situation. And the literature suggests that there are a variety of common barriers to empathy in situations or contexts where empathy tends to break down. And these include conflict situations, so situations where you have conflicting values and views, situations where an offense has taken place or some norm has been violated and you feel like you are in an adversarial situation with this person. You're basically incompatible with each other and have divergent interests and goals. Empathy also breaks down when we feel dissimilar to other people. There's a huge literature on an intergroup empathy gap, where as soon as we feel like someone is different from us, we feel that they're an outgroup in our outgroup, then empathy shuts down. And this is very unfortunate, but this happens along lines of race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, religious identification, and all types of differences. Really, it's important to be mindful of how when we feel dissimilar, there can be, age differences, generational, cultural differences, all kinds of dissimilarities that come into play. And certainly these days, political differences is a major one. But all of these dissimilarities really kind of interfere and shut down our empathic response. And then the third one is when we anticipate feeling distress. So we understand or we sense that being in this situation is going to cause us empathic distress. It's going to be uncomfortable for us to empathize with this person, or maybe will cause us suffering or burden, emotional burden to empathize with this person. And so we might disengage because we want to avoid that distress. So those are some major barriers supported in the literature. And I'd like you to think about some of your own barriers to experiencing empathy towards trainees and perhaps more broadly. Some of the ones that came up during the live session today were when students are showing a lack of investment, so they really don't seem to be motivated or to care about how much they're putting into this, into their training or into the relationship with their mentor. When they've been getting feedback or giving feedback to the trainee, but the trainee has not been responsive and has not been enacting any change. When the trainee is disrespectful to them or aggressive to them. So those are some of the common ones that were being expressed, where there really is a sense that this is maybe a one-sided relationship in terms of investment, and the trainee really isn't doing their part to be productive and get the full experience out of their training with you as a mentor. So I think it's, you might have a different barrier For me, one that I mentioned is when trainees complain a lot, or really anyone in my life complains a lot. I've always been a huge um, uh, love of gratitude, and it bothers me when people complain a lot. So I know that when I have, someone with a very negative kind of lens through which they see the world, and they're constantly whining is not a nice word to say, but complaining about what's going on in their life, especially when it seems not that serious to me, I tend to shut down empathically. So I've come to recognize that as a personal barrier for me. And what's nice about recognizing these barriers is that once you recognize what your barriers are, you can kind of use or look out for signals that might be something that you're experiencing in the situation. And that might be a signal to you to engage in empathic effort, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. So the third aim here is to learn ways that we can invest effort to overcome our own personal barriers to empathizing. For a long time, the literature on empathy suggested that it was really an automatic process. It was something that we either feel or we don't feel, and that there's really nothing that we could do about it if we don't feel empathy. And this presented a tremendous problem if it really is the case that in conflict situations or intergroup empathy situations where there's this gap, that there's nothing people could do about it. They can't empathize with this other person. But recent evidence suggests more and more that empathy is at least in part motivated and controllable. So you can approach empathy experiences and put yourself in a position to empathize and invest effort to empathize. And so with Carol Dweck and Jamil Zaki, who I worked with when I was a postdoc at Stanford, we developed this concept of empathic effort, which is a willingness to invest time or energy in feeling empathy. And the idea here is that people can try to change their empathy experience by increasing their effort. Okay, so you can actually have an impact on the empathy you feel by effortfully investing and changing the way you approach the situation. So what does this look like? How can you invest empathic effort? I'm going to lay out a few suggestions here. These are not the only things you can do, and it's going to differ across situations. But here are some general ideas for how you might invest empathic effort, especially in situations where you feel that your empathy might shut down. Okay, so one way is to engage in empathic or active listening. This is a term I'm sure you've heard before. You've probably even received some kind of training on it. Empathic listening is where you're going to put yourself in a position to really hear the other person. This means giving them your full attention, asking open-ended questions that really amplifies their voice, gives them an opportunity to speak, and puts you in a position to hear their perspective. This means offering validation where possible, and sometimes making sure that you're on the same page by restating or summarizing what they've said in your own words so that they can clarify if there are still discrepancies in what they've communicated and what you're hearing. And then something I always like to remind everybody: put away your technology. We are all better humans and better relationship partners in whatever the relationship context is when our technology is not in the room with us. So when you're having these conversations, please make sure to put away that technology so that it's not interfering with your ability to really be engaged and hear what the trainee is saying. I'm not going to spend that much time on empathic listening because, like I said, I think that you've probably all heard of it before and have a sense of what it is. I'm going to focus a little bit more on how you can try to learn something about the trainee or their point of view. And in doing this, this really puts you in a position to connect with the trainee, develop a sense of trust with them, and form a basis from which you can support them with a better understanding of who they are and what their needs are. So what I like to encourage people is to engage in perspective getting. This is different than perspective taking, which is what we hear all the time. Perspective taking is great too, but perspective getting is a more active process where you're going to actively effortfully seek out their perspective. Okay, so this goes back a little bit to empathic listening, but you're going to ask them questions that are directed at understanding life or the situation from their point of view. And this might feel sometimes, am I overstepping? Am I imposing by asking them these questions? You can always make it feel safe by saying, it's important that you feel uh, permitted to answer or not answer things that I ask you. But what I really want to know is I want to understand what's happening with you. I want to understand your perspective. So you want to frame your questions with that goal. You want them to know why you're asking them. You wanted them to feel safe because you are communicating to them that the purpose for your questions is to truly get a deeper understanding of who they are, what their needs are, so that you can better support them. And then I really want to emphasize the need to resist making assumptions about them and their experiences. This is so important. We make assumptions about everybody in our lives, and more often than not, we're probably wrong in our assumptions. This is because we only have access to what's in our own brains, and we don't know what's going on in their minds. And because communication is often so flawed, and there's so much lost in communication. So, we make these assumptions, and these assumptions truly, truly interfere with our ability to understand people and to provide the support that they need. So how can you resist making those assumptions? Well, certainly the perspective getting will help you with that. You're going to be gathering information. And specifically what you want to do is you want to try to get at underlying issues and needs. If you stay at the very surface of a problem, that might help you address that very specific problem, but only when you get at deep-rooted underlying issues and needs that the trainee has, can you really start to understand why they're acting the way they're acting, why they're struggling with this, or engaging in certain behaviors that are problematic, or experiencing that lack of motivation, or whatever the issue is. And only then can you really start to address the problem in a more holistic and kind of long-term way, where you can really address some of those deep-rooted needs and strategize with them about how to address those needs more fully, as opposed to just targeting one specific problem that lies on the surface. You can also educate yourself, asking them or doing your own research outside of the conversation on factors that might be contributing to their behavior in the situation, right? So cultural practices come into play here. Maybe there are contextual factors that you don't understand. And for both of these, when you're trying to get at underlying issues, when you're educating yourself on various factors that are contributing to the problem, you really be mindful that these trainees are complex human beings with a lot going on in their lives, just like we have a lot going on in our lives. They have so many different roles. Some of them are parents. Some of them have lost someone recently in their lives. They have relationship problems. They have part-time jobs or full-time jobs. They've got health issues. They have mental health concerns. There's so much going on. And I can say, I've been program chair for a few years now. And even though we have a small program, I'm constantly learning of things that our students are going through that are, really major life events and challenging situations. I mean, students in the pandemic, they were experiencing severe isolation and a lack of support, in addition to all the other stressors going on. Of course, things that are going on in the world around them it's terrifying, and it's concerning, and it's constant. So really be mindful that they have far more going on than what we see on the surface, and that what they're potentially willing to share with us. And keep that in mind when we're making judgments about who they are. Connected to this, I always encourage people to check your biases. You really want to be constantly working on this. This is not something that might be always the top of your awareness. And you have to actively work on it and reflect on it. What preconceptions are you bringing into the conversation about this person? What preconceptions have you brought to interactions in the past? Have you always treated them equitably? So really thinking through what your biases might be and what role you have played in contributing to the problem can be very beneficial. And then lastly, try to find a point of connection with the trainee. It can go such a long way. A similar value, a shared interest, a life event that you've both gone through. This can really create a sense of connection, of trust, a sense of a willingness to disclose to each other, and feel like this relationship is worth investing in, and that there is a clear pathway forward. Okay, so those are some strategies on how to empathize with your trainee, how to set a tone for the relationship that is connected, and there's strong communication, and you're listening and you're hearing them. And now I'm going to switch into something a little bit more, a little bit concrete here in terms of something that you can implement with your students in terms of actually addressing the problems in very concrete ways. And something that I've started doing with my trainees is working on individualized development plans. And I'm not the first person to think of this by any stretch. There are many people in our department who does it. And this is something that there's a literature on if you want to do your own research online. I'm going to share with you an IDP that I developed, adapted based off ones that were out there, and developed based on the needs of my students and the types of things that we focus on in my lab. But you can always adapt them for yourself. And I think that what these individualized training plans or development plans do is they really help the student anticipate challenges, think through their priorities and their what they're going to engage in over the next semester or year, while considering their longer term career goals. So, it can, when they're stressed and they're struggling and they're feeling unmotivated, they can really lose sight. And especially when they're hearing this feedback that doesn't feel that good to hear sometimes, they can really lose sight of why they're doing this. And keeping those long term goals at the forefront of their mind while they're considering how they're going to accomplish those goals can be a really beneficial framing for them and beneficial approach for them to take. So you'll see that some of these questions, it has them work through what are your long-term goals? What are some of the, what's motivating you towards those goals, and how are you planning to accomplish them? What progress towards completing your next milestones? And it's kind of get a little bit more concrete as we go down here. Your next milestone will you make during the upcoming year? Even more concrete. I'm a psychologist, so we do a ton of research. So list the lines of research you plan to make progress on this year. For each line of work, list the stage it's currently in, the number of studies you plan to conduct, and so on. So really making this concrete in terms of clear steps that they anticipate making in each kind of line of research. And now thinking about balance, right? So something students really struggle with is how to juggle all the balls. What strategies are you going to use to balance your TA or TF with your coursework and your research responsibilities? How do you plan to allocate your time across these various responsibilities? And then I think possibly most importantly, what challenges and barriers to your success do you anticipate? How do you plan to work through those? How can your mentor best support you? So the way this works is I'll have a student work on this IDP on their own. They'll then send me their completed IDP, and then we meet and we go through each response. I provide feedback on it. We talk about how to tweak things here or there. So it really is a collaborative strategy that you're going to develop together in terms of how they can make progress moving forward. And you can set this up for whatever timeline works best for you. If you think doing this every month, I mean, that would probably be a little too frequent and burdensome for the student, but maybe every semester. I would say at least every year. And you might align this with the annual report, that if your department does annual reports, whatever works best for you. But the idea is to get them thinking about this at a point where they're, starting something and are looking ahead in terms of, the next period of time. At the end of that period, whether it be a semester or a year, you're going to have some end of year reflections. So these are going to focus on what has happened as well as how they can improve further in the coming time period. So questions like, which of the previous year's goals did you meet? Identify areas in which you improved this year. Document factors that helped you reach your goals. So what's been working, what hasn't been working. Document reasons for not meeting any of the goals that you set for last year. So maybe there were too many goals. Maybe they had some special circumstances come up. Maybe they had time management issues. So really trying to get them to concretely identify what the barriers were to their own success and their ability to meet the goals that they set out for themselves. With that in mind, then how can they change the way they spend their time during the coming year, and what have they learned that can help them moving forward? And then, what did you do as a mentor that helped, that worked well? What requires improvement? And are there any ways that they would, that they can identify that you can better support them in the coming year? Okay. So again, this is joint responsibility, right? Thinking about how you can support them and working collaboratively with them to strategize so that you can optimize their success moving forward. So you can adapt these as you need. If you have a student who's been having problems in this IDP, you might specifically list out the problems that you've already discussed with them. I wouldn't surprise them with those problems in the IDP you send them. I would have that conversation first, and then maybe you specifically outline the specific issues, and then they can describe how they will overcome each of those specific issues or work towards overcoming them, and so on. I received a question in the live session earlier today. What do you do when you are giving a student feedback, or you're setting up goals for them, and they're continuously failing? You're not seeing improvement. So my answer to that was that you definitely want this to be an iterative process. You want to give them multiple chances and work on them over a period of time. So the last thing they want to feel is like you're giving them one shot and it all has to change, or you are out, they're screwed. That is not going to be a helpful mindset for them at all. So, the first thing I would do is if I had had this conversation with a trainee and I didn't see improvement over a period of time, I would have another conversation. I would sit them down and I would first ask them, what their thoughts. Did they see themselves as improving? Did they think that they had made changes? Or what had they tried and what had they not tried? And what did they think was working and what wasn't working? So kind of similar to these end of year reflections here. Really to hear their perspective, because it could very well be that they've made changes, but it hasn't resulted in tangible, evidence or productivity that you might be able to observe. So I would have a conversation with them, and you'll probably learn a lot about what they're going through and what their specific challenges are through that conversation. And then, just like anything else, it's going to require tweaking. You're going to have to re-strategize with them, help them identify those barriers and then transform those barriers into opportunities to make further changes that might be better suited to the problem and the barriers that they're facing. So you really want to think of this as not a one-time fix. This isn't one conversation and all the problems are going to go away. That's unlikely to happen, but you want to think of this as a continued process and commitment, where you're going to have multiple conversations and you're going to continuously check in, and hopefully over time and lots of tweaking, you're going to start to see improvement, and eventually see them on the trajectory that you want to see, or that the problem behavior is going away completely. A few final things to think about in terms of what you're communicating here. I would really encourage you to leave these conversations with your trainees. They've just been hit with a lot of overwhelming information. No matter how constructively and professionally and empathically you communicate this information, I'm sure it will still be hard for them to hear. So please, please, please make sure to communicate to them your continued investment in them as a trainee. It will feel very hopeless to them if they feel like there's no chance, if they feel like they might try to make these changes, but you're not committed to them anymore. You're so frustrated. So be explicit. Don't infer that because you're having this conversation with them that they're going to understand that you're trying to invest in their future and in their improvement. Really be explicit. Tell them directly, I am still invested in you. I see this as an opportunity for us to grow together. I'm excited about changing this up and seeing where this will take us. So really be mindful that you're communicating that directly. You also want to communicate your confidence in their capacity to meet the goals that you've laid out collaboratively. Communicate that, yes, expectations are high. They're in graduate school or they're a postdoc or whatever the position that they're in, but that you have full confidence that they can meet those expectations, and that that you see growth and that they have the capacity to grow, and that there's no doubt about it. Okay, and that with the proper support and proper strategizing, that you fully expect them to be able to make the changes necessary. And then finally, you want to communicate your plan for how you will communicate with them about their progress moving forward. Okay, so that again, they understand. Are you going to be checking in with them? When are you going to be, doing those end of year reflections for the IDP? What does the next conversation look like? Are you going to go through, a time log together where you're asking them to, lay everything out, so basically just really be clear about how you will continue to track their performance, or the changes that you hope to see, how you will communicate whether or not they're being effective in these changes. So, that they have a sense of what the future looks like in terms of what to expect from you in terms of your communication about their progress. Okay, so just a few final thoughts. I think that, for some of us, we have trainees who are far into their training, but when what I really like to do with new trainees, and then really continue this throughout, is from the very beginning, set a tone of open communication with my trainees that can facilitate conversations down the line. So from the very first meeting that I have with a new graduate student, I sit down with them and I talk to them about the communication that we're going to have, how I want there to be an open line of communication, how they can come to me in times of need, that I will be, open to hearing their concerns, that I want to, hear about their goals and their expectations for me, just as I will have goals and expectations of them, that kind of thing. So really to make it feel like a mutual partnership, where communication is open and there's going to be mutual respect and collaboration in our relationship. And I think if you do that from the outset, this can really set a tone of comfort and confidence and trust in your ability to mentor them through these problems, and their willingness to come to you with these issues, or hear you when you have these issues that you need to describe to them. There's research that shows that when we are receptive to others, that receptivity is reciprocated. Okay, so if you show receptivity towards your trainees' perspective, if you show open-mindedness and a willingness to listen, and you're encouraging them to share their views, that's going to encourage them to do the same towards you, to be receptive to what you're saying to them, and to really hear you and take what you have to say to heart and try to implement changes. Okay, so really try to model that receptivity for them, so that they can reciprocate in kind, and all of this will go much more smoothly. You really want to focus less on blame. This kind of goes back to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. This isn't about pointing fingers. This isn't about, what so much what they've done that's so horrible, or assigning blame to different parties. Really try to focus on the path forward. These are the issues. Let's think through how we can make changes, how we can continue to build our relationship, and how we can both grow. And then finally, I just like to encourage everybody to remember that these are skills you can develop, no matter how good you are at this already, or where you're starting out, or how little you thought about communication before, or where you are at in your career. We can always get better at communicating. So remember that these are skills that you can sharpen with practice, and that it's never too late to start to implement some of these practices and strategies more mindfully into your communication with trainees, but not just them, basically your communication with everyone in your life. So with that said, I hope that this has been informative and beneficial in some way. I want to, open the door to any of you reaching out to me with any comments or questions that you have. I thank you for your time listening this and your dedication to becoming more effective mentors. And absolutely feel free to reach out to me if I can help in any way in this area or in other types of conflict situations in your lives. All right, thank you. Take care.